If you are planning to start a home daycare, please don't wait until you have a problem with a parent before you start thinking about your policies, because when everything is going on well, you may think we can always talk about it. But what happens when maybe a parent is consistently late for pickup, when payment is late, when a child is sick, or when someone you've never met comes to pick up a child? What happens when you need to go on vacation, or when a child gets older and you don't have space available for the next age group? These are the things you need to think about before they happen, and that's why you need a good daycare policy manual. So hi everyone, you're welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Temi. I'm an early childhood educator and I'm a licensed childcare provider in Canada. So today we are talking about how you can write your home daycare policy. So I will actually encourage you to get a notebook, open a document, or save this video, because I'm going to walk you through the major policy areas that you should think about. So by the end of this video, you would have a good checklist that you can use to start to create your own policy manual. But please remember that childcare requirements are different depending on where you live. So use this video as a guide. Then check with your childcare regulations and licensing requirements for your own province or state or country. So let's get into it. The first thing is your program description. So the first thing I recommend putting in your policy manual is a simple description of your program. Tell families what your daycare is about, what ages you accept, what are your operating hours, how many children you can care for, what is your approach to childcare, and what type of learning environment you provide. Also include your operating hours, the ages, and also think about it as an introduction to your daycare. The next thing is the enrollment policy. So you need to think about what needs to happen before a child can actually start daycare in your care. So the forms that needs to be completed, what health information you need, their emergency contacts and information, and do you encourage families to visit before enrollment? Do you require a deposit? How much is the deposit? Whether the deposit is refundable or not? Like, all these things needs to be clear in your policy. Your policy should be able to answer all these questions. And don't just collect money without explaining what it is for and what happens to it when care ends. Put everything in writing. So now the next thing is the fees and payment. Now let's talk about money. So this is one area where you really need to be clear. Your policy should answer questions like, when are the childcare fees due? How should parents pay? Are they paying weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly? And do parents pay when their child is absent? What happens when a payment is late? Do you charge late payment fees? What happens if a payment is returned? Like, if there's not sufficient funds, what happens? Do you provide receipts? And if your program accepts childcare subsidy or government funding, how that works too. For example, what happens while a child is waiting for subsidy approval, and who is responsible for the amounts that are not even covered by subsidy? So you need to figure all these things before a payment issue happens, and you need to write them down from the beginning. In your policy, you also need to write withdrawal and ending care. You need to explain how the child care arrangements can end. How much notice does a parent need to give you? And does that notice have to be in writing? Everything has to be clear. Then what happens when they don't give you enough notice? Right? So this policy is not just talking about how parents would end care. It should also explain situations where you as a provider may need to end the childcare arrangement. For example, when there's repeated unpaid fees, serious safety concerns, repeated non-compliance with policies, or situations where the arrangement is simply no longer working. Hopefully you never need to use this policy, but if you ever do, you'll be glad that the expectations were established even before the situation happened. So this policy, very important. But the next policy now is the arrival, departure, and attendance. You need to think about your arrival policies. When does your daycare open? And do they need to arrive within a particular window, like maybe between 8 to 10, and after 10? All those things you need to put it and make it clear. What time must the children be picked up? And what happens when the children are not picked up on time, when the parents are late? And if you charge a late pickup fee, put the amount and how it is calculated. Are you charging $1 per minute? Everything has to be clear. And you also need to explain the responsibility for child transfers between the parents and you. For example, when the child signs out, you need to make it clear that, okay, after the child signs out of the daycare, the child is in full custody of the parents, and you are no longer responsible for what happens to the child after daycare hours. Everything needs to be clear. And also, don't forget the small things. Don't forget about parking, maybe the rules about parking in your area, and no, everything has to be clear. What entrance should they use, and all of that. So all these tiny details can create really big frustrations if you don't make it very clear. Now, release of children, very important. You need to make it clear in your policy who can pick up a child. There must be a clear policy for this, because you can't just release a child to somebody because the child is saying, okay, I know this person. Everything needs to be clear. Do you require written authorization? Do you check identification? What happens during emergency pickup? And parents should also know that they need to keep their authorized pickup information current. This is not just about convenience, it's just about safety. So the next policy that's very, very important is behavior guidance. Every daycare should have a clear behavior guidance policy. So parents need to understand how you respond when children are struggling with behavior. So your policy should explain the approaches you use: redirection, choices, problem solving, co-regulation, consistent routines, clear expectations, calm communication. Your policy also needs to explain the practices you don't use. Like, children should not be physically punished, humiliated, threatened, or shamed, or deprived of basic needs. And your approach should protect the child's safety, dignity, and rights. And also remember that children are different, and sometimes an individual child may need additional strategies or a support plan that will be developed together with the family. Very, very important. Now, the next policy that is extremely important is illness policy. Please don't skip this one. You need to decide when a child should stay at home. What happens if they have a fever, they have vomiting, they have diarrhea, or a contagious illness? And what happens if those symptoms even begin while the child is already at the daycare? How quickly should the parents come? When can the child return back to the daycare? And do you require medical clearance in certain situations, like maybe during they have a communicable illness? Like, everything has to be clear. So don't wait until a sick child arrives at your door before you have this conversation. It's very, very important. Your medication policy is also important. You should write in your policy whether you administer medications and on what conditions. And do you require written parental consent? Does your prescription medication need to be in its original container? How will it be stored? How will you document each dose? What happens if you need refrigeration? All of these things are very, very important. And you also need to check the local requirements, because medication rules can actually vary depending on where you operate. So this is very, very important. Check with is holidays, vacation, and closure. Very, very important. When is your daycare closed? On statutory holidays, are you closed? Will families still need to pay for these days? What happens when you're on vacation? Do parents pay for during their vacation? As in, do parents pay when you are on vacation? And how much notice will you provide when they are going on vacation? And what happens if you need to close unexpectedly, maybe for an emergency and all of that? All these rules are very important and needs to be clear, right? So parents also need to plan. They need to know what to expect. So you need to give them ample notice and make everything clear in your policies. Also, in your policy, your daily routine and activities should be in your policies, because parents want to have an idea of what the program would look like. And of course, plans may change, but you just need to have an idea of what it is, and to also help you to provide structure that, okay, maybe we come in the morning, we have arrival and free play. Children just play freely. Then meals, snacks, indoor play, outdoor play, structured play, everything, diapering, nap, quiet time, everything should be clearly written in your policy manual. Another thing that is very important is you need to write it in your policies how you will communicate with the parents. Are you going to be using text messages, phone calls, email, or do you have an app? Like, all these things are very, very important, and it needs to be written in your policy manual. You also need to write in your policy how you will handle private information about individual children. Everything is very, very important. Next policy is transportation, walks, and outings. So if you'll be transporting the children, it has to be written in your policies. Okay, I will transport children, I will not transport children. Everything has to be written clearly. Will you take the children on neighborhood walks? Will you go on field trips, nearby parks? And when will you require parental permission? How much notice will you provide? How will parents know where you are, and all of that? The safety items you will take with you. These are very, very important things that you need to put in your daycare policy manual. The next policy is photography and video. So if you take pictures or videos of the daycare children, you need a policy, and you need to state what those pictures will be used for. Will they be shared privately with the parents? Are they used for documentation? Do you have security cameras? Can parents opt out? And if you are a content creator or use social media, you need to be very careful here. So don't just assume because that once a child is enrolled to your daycare, automatically you are permitted to just post their image on Facebook, Instagram, and all of that. You need to get the appropriate consent and clearly explain how the images and videos will be used. Also, inclusion policy is very important. How do you support children with different abilities, cultures, languages, family backgrounds, and individual needs? Like, how will you work with the families? How will you collaborate with other professionals, like maybe speech pathologists and all of that? Everything needs to be written clearly in your policy manual. And what reasonable adaptations can you make within your program? And very, very important, the next policy is the emergency procedures and safety. So every daycare needs to think about emergencies before an emergency even happens. So what happens if there's a fire? Where will you evacuate to? Do you have emergency shelter location? What happens if you need to shelter in place? How will parents be contacted? Do you conduct emergency drills? Where are your first aid kits? Do you maintain a first aid and CPR certification? Everything has to be written clearly in your manual. Okay, what safety equipment do you have? And you have to make everything clear. Finally, your policy manual should not be something you just write once and never look at it again. Your daycare will grow, you will learn, regulations may change, like your program may even change. So you need to keep reviewing it over and over from time to time. So when you have created your policy, don't just send it to the parents and just assume that they have read it. You have to create a process for the parents to confirm that they have received, read, understood, and agreed to the policies. Right? So even before a family starts, you need to ensure that they have received the policies, read the policies, understood it, and agreed to it. Very, very important. Finally, before you finish your policy manual, you have to read the entire thing again from a parent's perspective. Ask yourself, is this clear? Could someone interpret this differently? And does this policy explain what will happen if it is not followed? And have I clearly explained what I expect from families? And does this policy actually reflect how my daycare operates? So don't just go online and just copy and paste someone else's policies. You, of course, you can use it as a template, as a guide, but don't just copy and paste. Do what will work for your daycare, right? Because your daycare is different, and even local regulations may actually be different. So you need to like look through, sit down, and ensure that it is written thoroughly and you're not leaving anything out. So if you're setting up your daycare policies, you need to think through it. You can create different scenarios in your mind and ensure that your policy has a way to handle all of it, right? So that nothing will catch you by surprise. So if you have been following my daycare setup series, this is just one of them. So I encourage you to subscribe to my channel, and I'll be posting videos every Sunday. A video will drop concerning daycare and all of that. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye.